Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Sandy.
And this is the Italian American Stories podcast. Well, we are excited to be back and recording.
Yeah.
It's been a couple weeks. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before. I'm a teacher, so it's always a little bit of work going back to school.
And a sick one now.
Yeah. So you can probably hear it in my voice. First full week back with the kids, I came down with some nasty cold, but it happens every year. You get all those kids together and the classrooms just turn into a germ room, basically.
This one's hanging on to you this time.
I'm probably on like day 12 or 13. And yeah, it's really funny because now it's starting to spread. So the principal at my school has it now. Another teacher has it. All the kids are fine. Yeah. It's just all the adults that are getting sick. It is, yeah. So, but I'm hoping, since it's so early in the school year, I just get all the germs in me, build up my immune system, and I don't get sick again. Knock on wood. Yeah. But yeah, so we're excited to be back today, and I'm actually really excited about today's story. I actually ran across this story while researching another one. As I kind of started looking into it and looking at the pictures of Margaret and Guido Rossi, they are so adorable. I was hooked. I was like, we got to do this story.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
It's a Colorado story, so they are Colorado Italians, which is pretty cool. And so with that being said, today's story is about Margaret and Guido Rossi, and they owned a ranch in the Yampa Valley area of Colorado. And they lived right around the town of Oak Creek, Colorado. And so for those people who are not familiar with Colorado, Steamboat Springs is kind of a more famous town. It's kind of around that area a little bit.
Yeah, Oak Creek is about 24 miles from
Steamboat. Okay, just a really small...
South of it.
Okay, yeah, just a really small town. And actually, we have a lot of connections to Oak Creek.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time there. Grandpa did too with Don from Don's Club Tavern.
Yeah, his buddy.
Yeah, because him and his wife had a house there, and they all went up there all the time to stagecoach fishing and running around.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then we all started. Ted and I did a lot of time up there.
Yeah, I remember going there a couple times as a kid with kind of like with our small Doan family, but then even with you and Ted's my stepdad. And then we do fishing and stuff like that. So
yeah, you and Jared have even met us up there.
Yeah, we met up there. Yeah. And Ted actually caught some pretty good brook trout. No, what were they?
They were cutthroats.
Cutthroat trout.
They were natives. Yeah, he had them mounted.
Yeah, actually, Jared and I have them now.
Yeah, that's
so.
Right. Yeah.
So just for context, Ted was my stepdad. He passed away a few years ago, and so, but yeah, they were like 18 inches long.
I tried to find that yesterday.
Yeah.
In his journals, and I couldn't find
them. They were beautiful fish, though. So, native fish have more color to them versus the stock fish that are, bred in the what do they call those, hatcheries?
Right.
Yeah, and so these were just beautiful fish, but it's a beautiful area up there too. It's
yeah, there's a lot to do.
Yeah.
For outdoor stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Oak Creek is now. Is kind of like a hub for hunters and fishermen and stuff versus what it was during the Rossi's time.
Yeah, it was probably all mining and stuff like that.
Mining and ranchers, yeah, exactly.
And having Stagecoach Lake right there.
Yes.
Oak Creek, it's only 5 miles from there.
Yeah, so you could walk up there.
That's a huge lake.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I do want to give a little bit of history on Oak Creek. So in the 1930s, it was a really bustling little town. It had, like Mom said, a bunch of mines and ranches. But in the 1950s, the mines all closed down and Oak Creek almost became a ghost town. So a lot of the younger people, they had to move out because they needed work. But a lot of the older people stayed and, because either they were retired or they had a ranch. And so the population for a really long time was mostly elderly people. But then a lot of people from Denver and Colorado Springs, they came and bought up the houses for really cheap and made them like summer homes. They were kind of abandoned. So they were probably bank-owned homes and stuff like that. I think I even saw in one of the papers that I read that they would just come down and pay the taxes that were due. And then the house the deed would get turned over to them. So
Oh, wow.
I
That's
know.
nice, because they're probably worth a lot now.
Oh, they're probably $500,000
I
homes. Here's a shack from 1930 for $580,000. It's crazy. And so, like Mom and I talked about earlier, the town is still around, and it does still have ranches, but it is honestly just more of a stop for outdoorsmen. Like, and it's got like couple little restaurants. It's kind of a one-road town, though, basically.
Yeah, that is all it is.
That's it.
Yeah, it has a grocery store, small grocery store, a liquor store. And every time we would go there, one restaurant was closed and another one was open because they don't make it long.
Well, no, I mean, because the winters are so bad that you have to make all your money in those summer months. Because as we'll get into in this story, Guido and Margaret, they were sometimes locked at their ranch from November to May if the winters were really bad. So I can see how restaurants, you've got to have some money in the bank to survive up there.
Right, and having the steamboat so close. And,
true.
There's some nice places to eat there.
Oh, yeah, steamboat can be a little fancy. So we're going to go ahead and start off by talking about Guido. So Guido Rossi was born on October 14th, 1912, and he was born in Oak Creek, Colorado.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine Oak Creek in 1912?
Wow.
I mean, it's 3 houses maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder if there was even a town.
My guess is it probably a post office. Yeah, probably, exactly. And then just ranches and homes for the miners. That's probably about it.
That's true.
So his parents were Marino and Anna. So Marino, he came to America first in 1899, and he settled in New Mexico for a while before finding his way to Colorado. And I think once he got established in Colorado, he went back to Italy and he married Anna in 1906. And then she came to Colorado in 1910. So Marino, he worked in the mines for a while, and then he found his way to Oak Creek around 1910, where his brother was working on various ranches. So it's interesting because they're obviously Italian, but his parents on Ancestry.com, it shows that they were born in Austria, but on other documents like censuses and one of their, oh my gosh, I'm having a complete, like the papers that they fill out to become a citizen. I can't think of what those are called. Well, anyway, so the papers that they fill out to become a citizen of America, it shows that they were born in Italy. So who knows? I mean, maybe the lines switched at some point and it used to be Italy and now it's Austria. Who knows? But Marino and Anna, they bought a ranch in Oak Creek in 1922, and it was a fully functioning running ranch. The guy who they bought it from he was older and he was done with it. So they had 5 kids, and Guido was the second oldest. And Guido, he went to school in Oak Creek, and I know they had a school there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's not a school there now.
Yeah.
There is? Oh, okay.
Up on the hill.
Oh, I do remember that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It's probably the same. Well, I don't know if it's the same school
a lot
then.
of it is new, but there could be a part
That they kept from the old. That's true. Yeah. And while going to school, he also started working on just different ranches in the area to make money. And he married Margaret Alice Chamberlain on September 30th, 1939. And they were married in Steamboat Springs. So let's talk about Margaret really quick. She was born on August 7th, 1921 in Nebraska, and moved with her family to Colorado when she was 2 years old. And her family, they settled in the Oak Creek area after moving sort of all around Colorado quite a bit. And she also graduated from Oak Creek High School in 1939. Can you imagine that graduating class? 4 kids, maybe? So
they couldn't make the graduation. They were all working on the ranch.
They were all working on the ranch, yeah. This is a cool story about Margaret. So one of her first jobs that she had in the Oak Creek area was that of a cook on a ranch. And so Margaret's father got hired on this ranch to mow hay. So Margaret went with her dad to help the, quote, lady of the house cook for all the men, for all the ranchmen. But it's funny because when Margaret got there, the lady of the house was gone because she got mad at her husband. So apparently she got mad at her husband and she moved back to where her mother was. So Margaret was left to cook for 18 men for 3 weeks when she was 15.
Wow.
I know. Isn't that crazy? So So my guess is it was probably summertime and her dad got hired and she was like, well, I'll go with you and make some money. And so she ended up cooking all on her own. So after this, her dad must have really liked Oak Creek because they ended up staying in Oak Creek and making that their home. And that's when she met Guido. So they actually met at the high school prom, but apparently Guido was dating her friend. But when that ended, that relationship, her and Guido started dating. So they started dating in May of 1939 and were married by that September. And like I said earlier, they got married in Steamboat Springs at the Holy Name Catholic Church. And it was just a small ceremony with just their friends and family. So Guido and Margaret, they ended up buying 800 acres after they got married in Oak Creek.
Wow.
Yeah. And on this 800 acres, there was a one-room cabin that they lived in. But this was just a one-room cabin, no electricity, no plumbing. So they had to bring their own water in. And so they had their first child, Daniel Marino Rosso, on April 29th, 1943. And Margaret, she couldn't have kids, so they adopted Daniel. And later on, they also adopted a baby girl who they named Cheryl. And Daniel was 7 months old when they adopted him, and Cheryl was 5 years old when they adopted her. And they adopted Cheryl a few years after adopting Daniel. They wanted them to be right around the same age, so that was why the age difference, yeah. And so, like I said earlier, they had no plumbing in the cabin, and so they start having these kids, and that one-room cabin gets a little crammed. And so in 1949, they started building their own home, and they laid the foundation for this new home, and then they hired 2 young men to help them finish their home. And by the next year, their house was complete. So
they had plumbing.
And they had plumbing. Yes, exactly. That was the big thing that they had was plumbing. And it's cool because I saw in one article that their ranch was really near Croshow Lake.
And that's where we fished a lot. That's where Ted caught both of those
natives.
Fish.
Yeah, that's cool. The native, what were they called? Cutthroat. I wanted to say crawfish.
I'm wondering, when we would go, there's Allen Basin is a lake right across from Croshow on the same road.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a hike-in only lake, and it's a steep hill. But we had found out that there was a private road that goes straight to it, but it's a gate. It's private.
So you can't get in it.
Right.
Yeah.
But the guy told us, but if you go down to this house, and I want to almost say it was the Rossi house.
That's so crazy.
For $20, they give you the key to the gate for the day, and then you can drive right down to Allen Basin.
Versus having to hike into it.
Right. I'm wondering, and I tried to find it in his journals too, but all he had put was, we went and got the key from the farmhouse.
Yeah, so Ted always kept really detailed journals.
Right.
And so when I was telling Mom about this story that we were going to do, and I told her it was near Croshow Lake and it was the Rossis, she immediately was like, oh my gosh, that sounds familiar. I think we used to get a key from the Rossis. And
it was all private land there, so... And the house was right down the road.
See, that makes total sense. And then Mom even said that there was a smaller house next to it and then a bigger house, which like we just talked about, they started off in the one-room cabin and then built the bigger house. So
I'll bet it was.
I bet it was. And Mom immediately was like, oh my gosh, I think that was the house. And she even said, like, you kept saying, like, I know it started with the letter R.
Right.
So I would bet you money. How crazy is that?
I know.
Such a weird connection to
and
just...
you come up with this story.
With this story. I mean, I could have...
Neat.
It is. It's really neat. Like, we could have picked any... There was actually a bunch of Italian Americans who lived in this area, but to pick this story to do.
Right.
So cool. So they built their new home and they had plumbing. And then the next year, they had electricity added to the home. So, and this was around 1951, and Margaret said she felt like a queen.
I'm sure.
She talked about their new home, and she's like, it was not a big house by any means. She was like, but going from a one-room cabin with no plumbing or electricity to a bigger home with all these amenities, she's like, I felt like a queen.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't know how people did that.
I don't either. I can't even imagine. And then also thinking about, so Jared and I, we used to have a kind of a farm property with like 13 acres. And you get so dirty. Like you can go out for a couple of hours and you are filthy. Like, and then to have to bring in your own water.
Yeah, it's amazing. But, they just didn't know anything.
They didn't exactly. That was the norm. I mean, yeah, because we had well water on our property, but it was just pumped right into the house. Right. So, and so, like I said, I don't know if I said this earlier, but the one room cabin that they had, they just turned it into a storage shed.
Yeah.
And so they bought the 800 acres, but when they first started farming it, I guess you could say, they actually started by growing vegetables like spinach and lettuce to sell. And these were really hard crops to raise, so they were in higher demand. So they would get more money for these crops. And these crops were actually called or referred to as stoop labor because you always had to stoop or lean over to tend it and cut it. And so it was just a really, hard crop, I guess, to raise. And so Margaret, she actually later said that these crops made them so much money that it made them more money than their cows in their hay did. And they actually, Isn't that crazy? They were actually able to pay their ranch off. And then once they did that, they completely switched to just raising cows and growing hay. So it must have just during this time been a really high demand, maybe shipping it to Denver, Colorado Springs. And so
it must have been a massive garden.
I think so. She said, I saw in an article where she said that they would take just truckloads up to a hub and then somewhere in the Yampa Valley, and then the hub would just take it all to Denver. So Margaret said, though, she did still grow vegetables in her own garden and did canning, but it was obviously not a big production, just meant to feed their family. So speaking of fishing, Guido also loved to fish. And it makes me wonder if he fished at the Allen Basin Lake because it was on their property.
Right, I'm sure they did.
I bet so. And so it was obviously, a fun hobby for him. He just really enjoyed it. But like the vegetable garden, it also helped feed their family.
Right.
So Margaret would go with him from time to time, but she said fishing frustrated her. And so most of the time she would just bring a book and lay, in the meadow and read. But she said one day she tried fly fishing and she really got into fly fishing, which totally get it.
Yeah, versus just lake fishing.
Oh yeah, Mom and I have talked about this before, like lake fishing, but I'll fly fish all day long, but just a regular reel and rod.
Just sitting there.
Oh, I can't do that at all. And it's fun because you kind of have that constant movement, and you can go find pools, little still pools of water to bob your exactly, bob your fly in. And so totally get it, Margaret. And she said she actually found it really relaxing, and it was something that her and Guido could do together.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. And so Margaret, during this time, she would also sew most of the family's clothing. Of course, because it probably saved them money, but living in Oak Creek at this time, there was probably not a lot of shopping options.
No, they'd have to go to Steamboat, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. And so she also made their own soap, bread, and barley coffee. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
I haven't either. So I saw somewhere that in one of the articles I was reading that if they were snowed in for a few months, they would drink barley coffee because they couldn't get to a regular to a store to get coffee. And it's actually kind of a thing. I Googled it and it's kind of
I've never heard of it.
I would almost say it's kind of a bougie thing right now. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But I'd never heard of it either. But yeah, and it's naturally caffeine free. It has a ton of vitamins and minerals. And so now I kind of want to try it. But
yeah, I wonder. Well, like you said, you Googled it.
Yeah.
So it must be in the store.
Exactly.
Maybe health food stores.
Maybe health food stores. Yeah, because it did look a little expensive. I was like, geez, Louise. So it was funny. She told a story about how chores were always a big thing because the water and living on a farm, it's hard. Never ending chores. And so she said that when it was time to clean their quilts, that was always a big production. And so she would clean them outside in a big metal tub. And it's probably one of those round metal aluminum trough. Yeah, where they, the ranchers fill up water. And so she would fill it up with water, put the soap in it, and then she would have the kids go out and stomp on the quilt for a while. So what pops into my head is I Love Lucy, that episode where she's stomping on the grapes. And so she said, probably middle of summer, super hot.
Right, the kids probably loved
they probably loved quilt cleaning day. Yeah. And then she'd just hang them up and dry them. So I thought that was kind of a cool story.
That is. And it works.
Yeah, works great.
The washing machine, it agitates it.
Exactly. Just, okay, kids, now reverse and go the other way. And so, yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. But the winters were really, really hard on the Young family. They were extremely isolated in Oak Creek. Even in the summers, they were isolated, but they could move around in the summers. Winters, not so much. And so they would try to get together with other ranchers who lived around them. And they said they would even go visit neighbors by horse or sled. She said sometimes they'd pull the kids on a sled behind the horse.
They get a lot of snow.
They get a ton of snow. And I can imagine the isolation that you would feel out there. Well, when we lived out on that farm property, we'd be snowed in sometimes for a week or two, and you're just kind of like, holy smokes. I mean, you're just out there. So
yeah, you get to the store or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you'd watch the weather, be like, okay, we have a storm coming in. We got to go get prepped for it. And back then in like the 1950s and stuff, I mean...
Yeah, I always worried about you guys out there.
Yeah, mom didn't like that. And so one crazy thing that Margaret talked about would happen in the winter sometimes, their son would have to get to school by horseback. And it was only 2 miles away. But if the snow is 5 feet deep, and you're talking that he was in first grade at this point, that's probably taller than him.
Right.
And so they would have to take him to school by horseback, but they would only have to do this for a couple of years. And then the school's got a bus route. But there was even times that the buses couldn't even run because the roads were so bad. So
then you got to have the plow first.
You got to, exactly, because you can't, yeah. And so she said that until the roads became paved and maintained, they were basically snowed in at their ranch from November to May.
Oh, good grief.
That's crazy. She said the snow would get so deep that they would jack their vehicles up on cinder blocks so that the tires wouldn't rot. That makes sense because if your tires are just sitting in snow, freezing and unfreezing and all that. And they would just ride horses in the winter. So... this is a really cool story about their winters. So Margaret, she had to travel to Denver in the middle of winter for some type of business thing. I couldn't really figure out why she was going, but the snow was so deep that they couldn't get to the main highway. They couldn't get there by horse. It was just such a bad winter. They got so much snow. But she really needed to go to Denver. So the neighboring ranches around them started creating trails. So they'd go out there and shovel and create a trail from one ranch to another. So she'd go to one ranch, then go to the other ranch until she could get up to the highway where her sister-in-law was waiting for her and took her to Denver.
Oh, wow.
How cool is that?
Yeah, that's really nice.
So, and she said it was they took care of each other. Exactly. She said it was only 5 miles from her house to the main highway. And Guido took her, I'm assuming by horseback. And she said, she's like, I had all my luggage and my big snow boots on. But she said, this is really funny. She said when she got to downtown Denver, she's like, I've got my luggage. And she's like, I've got my big snow coat on. And I've got these knee-high bright blue snow boots on. And she's like, I get to Denver and she's said there's no moisture there at all, no snow. She's like, people are just kind of wearing small little coats. And she's on 17th Street, so she's downtown Denver. And she said she had to go shopping because she's like, I looked completely out of place.
That's funny.
And so she told her mom the story later on, and she goes, well, they must have known that you were a hick or they would have put you away. So I thought that was kind of a cute story.
She was homeless with her and everything that she had.
Yeah, or lost her mind and thought it was crazy weather. And so she was interviewed later on in life, and the interviewer asked her if she missed the good old days. And she said, quote, first, I would like to say the best thing about the good old days is they are gone.
That's a good saying.
Yeah, and she said, you know, she went on to elaborate that obviously there were things that I liked better about back then. She was like, but living where we did, we appreciated as technology and stuff got improved.
Right.
So can't blame her on that one.
No.
And so for Guido, he loved running the ranch. He never really even wanted to leave his ranch unless he was going to visit family. He just loved being on it. And people said that they would see him out in his field on his rusty tractor, and he would run hundreds of cattle every year, and he'd plow the fields. And I guess he always had on overalls, but he would always have one strap hanging off, hanging over his shoulder or hanging down. Guido, he was known to have quote, selective hearing. And this drove Margaret crazy. She said she could talk to him for like 20 minutes and then later, ask him a question about their conversation. And he would just look at her and say, I don't know. I couldn't hear you. And she would just drive her crazy. But she said it was really funny because she could be in the kitchen talking to a friend and Guido would be in another room. And if they started talking about something that would interest him, Guido would yell from the other room and add to the conversation. And so she said his selective hearing was something that drove her crazy. Selective. Yeah. And this next part about Guido, it's probably one of my favorite tidbits of this whole entire story. But before we get into it, let's talk about what a party telephone line is. Do you know what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. So for our listeners out there who don't, so phone companies, they first started using party lines in the late 1800s. And by the mid 20th century, they were used across the country, but it was mostly used just in country areas, kind of like where Margaret and Guido lived. And so basically this party line, it would connect multiple phones to one phone line. So like if you think of a ranch area, it might be like 5 different ranches all sharing one phone line. And so each home often had a unique ring to signify which home should pick up the receiver. So their own ringtone, if you think about it. So like I said, like multiple homes would be on one line and you could pick up the receiver. And if you heard people talking, you'd have to wait to place the call. And it was kind of an honor system. So if you pick up the phone and you hear your neighbors talking to their family in Boston or whatever, you should hang up the phone and not listen to the conversation. Or you could be a nosy noserton and listen to the whole conversation.
You know that happened.
Oh, for sure. I did see that they passed a law at one point saying if your neighbor gets on the phone and says that it's an emergency and they need to call the police, you have to hang up. So, but
they had to make it a law. It's just not common courtesy.
Not common courtesy.
Of course, then people would lie.
That's true. That's probably like, oh, you're lying again, Bob. I'll get off the phone in 10 minutes. Yeah. So, but back to Guido. In the winters, he would get a little bored at times. And he would pick up the party line and quietly listen to all the ranchers' conversations that were happening in the valley.
That's funny.
And Margaret said she would catch him and have to get him off the phone. And and I guess she would get him off the phone and he'd just laugh. And
that's funny.
I don't know why. I just thought that was so funny. So cute.
And then they probably gossip all the rest of the time.
Oh, I'm sure.
Did you hear about
Margaret, guess what people of blah, blah, blah are doing down the road next Christmas? So, but in 1956, Guido's parents, they both fell ill and they didn't live too far from them. They were kind of in the same vicinity. They had their own ranch. And Margaret, she stepped up and decided to take care of them so that they could stay at home in their last few days. But this took a really big toll on her. And of course on Guido too. But Margaret, after Guido's parents passed away, she told a reporter later on that she, quote, had a mental collapse after their death.
Oh.
Yeah. And so it sounds like she moved from her own ranch to their home. She just lived there and took care of them. Yeah. So that was probably pretty hard on her. So they passed away in 1956. And in 1957, Guido decided that he needed to help Margaret get out of this state of depression, I guess you could call it. And he decided that she needed something to focus on. And he thought that maybe it would help her feel better if she had people to take care of again, because it sounds like she was just that really caring person. Yeah. And so he went and talked to the local doctor that was in Oak Creek. His name was Dr. Leslie. He asked if Margaret could come help him out. And the doctor was like, sure. And so then he asked Margaret, and Margaret was like, all right, I'll do it. And so she liked it so much that she started studying nursing under him and became a certified nurse.
Oh,
yeah.
Good for her.
And so she worked with him until 1959, though, and then he closed his office. And she said that this actually really did help her. She said that she's a person that needs to be motivated and have something to do. And so she was really appreciative that Guido did that.
Wonder if she continued it.
Well, funny you say that, because this nursing experience actually opened up a few new doors for her, because in 1964, Margaret actually started a project where nurses would travel to all the different small towns around Oak Creek and visit the elderly people that were there, or the people who couldn't drive or get themselves to a facility. So like I talked about earlier, there was a very high population of elderly who were in Oak Creek. I think at this time it was 26%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so a lot of them either didn't drive anymore, never drove, or just didn't like driving in the winters, which can't blame them there. Right. And so she started a project called the Friendly Visitors and Transportation Service. And so nurses would come and check in on people, just kind of help them out a little bit, or they got a van and they would transport them to Steamboat, which was, like you said earlier, like 20 some miles away. Right. So,
wow, that's neat.
So she started this, and she was able to fund it by getting grants from the government.
Wow.
Yeah. But
she did a lot.
She did a lot. Yeah. She loved the community that they lived in, and really she was always trying to improve it. But sadly, the government funding, it ran out after 5 years, and the community, they were either not willing to or couldn't fund the project. So the project, it did die out for a few years until I think like the mid 70s, when they started building more medical facilities. But it did help for quite a few years.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And her work, it didn't go unnoticed, because in 1968, she received one of 3 awards honoring women in Colorado who have contributed to their community.
Wow.
How cool is that? And
that's way cool coming from that little town.
Little tiny town. Exactly.
Because you're competing with Denver.
Colorado Springs. And so the ceremony, it was actually held at the Brown Palace in Denver.
Wow.
Which is fancy. And so Brown Palace, if you've ever heard of the unsinkable Molly Brown, she was on the Titanic. She had a hotel built in Denver. And so it's still there. You can go have tea at high noon. Right. And she said that it was really neat because her and Guido went, and she said it was so fancy, and she's like, it was really fun, but we felt out of place. Yeah. And so she was given $1,000, and half of it would go to a charity, and then the other half was just for her. So she gave the $500 to the St. Martin's Catholic Church in Oak Creek, and that was the church that they went to, and they were really involved in the Catholic Church.
Nice.
And she even made it on the Denver News. They said that the project was the realization of one woman's dream, and that woman was Margaret Rossi. So when she was being interviewed on the Denver News, it was kind of funny because, they were just asking her about the project, and they asked her, how the elderly people in the area felt about it. And she said, quote, "They like it. They have a reason to primp and put on lipstick and a clean shirt." She had a good sense of humor, and she credited a lot of this success to the project's success to Guido. He kind of helped her get out of that and get into nursing. Right. And he really supported her in this project, because a lot of times she would be away from home for a while. She would be visiting elderly people or taking them to Steamboat Springs, but then sometimes she'd have to stay in Steamboat Springs if she couldn't get back and didn't want to drive at night. And so she said that he really supported her. And she told the reporter that he supported me, but Guido wouldn't approve if I were out playing bridge. But he says, as long as anyone needs me, I should go. Yeah. And so the governor at the time, his name was John Love, and he actually appointed Margaret to the Colorado State Health Planning Council. And her role on the council was to help allocate funds to local health agencies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she did quite a bit. And then in the 1960s, she started developing a few health problems, and she had a near-death experience when she fell into a diabetic coma. And Guido found her, and she had to spend some time in Denver at a hospital. But she said once she recovered, she felt like God gave her a second chance, and she just needed to continue her work at making the community better. So she took that experience and turned it around.
Wow.
She was pretty amazing.
Right.
Yeah. And she even got, in 1970, she even was invited to the White House, where she was honored for her work with the elderly.
Wow.
And it was really funny because I tried finding more information on this, but I found more information about her award that she got in 1968 at the Brown Palace. So
I wonder if she knew she was diabetic.
I don't think that she did because there was no mention of it before that. And then I think because she felt like it was a second chance, like she didn't know and she fell into that coma.
Sense.
So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I don't know for sure, but so during all of this time, while Margaret was working with the community and Guido was running the ranch, her and Guido's children, they were living full lives as well. So their daughter, Cheryl, she married her future husband, Richard, in 1973, and she trained in the Army Corps to be a nurse as well. And then her and her husband, they moved to San Francisco where they raised their kids. In 1960, their son, Daniel, he joined the Army after graduating from Oak Creek High School, and he ended up serving overseas in Germany, and ultimately he went to Vietnam. He got married in 1968 to Luann Chesney, and they knew each other from high school. And after Daniel got out of the service, the couple, they lived on the ranch with Guido and Margaret for a while, but then they moved to Craig, Colorado, and that's pretty close to Oak Creek, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not far.
Not too far.
It's farther than Steamboat. There's big mines up there too.
Okay, so that makes sense. And Daniel and Luann, they had 2 daughters together. And while living in Craig, Daniel, he was a heavy machine operator for Utah International. And so the couple, while they were living in Craig, they seemed to be doing okay for a few years. But I think Daniel, he struggled from his time in Vietnam, and this took a toll on their marriage. Margaret even said at one point that he struggled a lot with alcohol, but he did overcome that. But I think it was hard on their marriage. And then in 1979, a lot of things happened in 1979. In May, Daniel called the police to report a threatening call. And there was no information on this. And I know that it sounds like I just kind of threw this in, but it might have relevance to an event that happens a little bit later. I thought I would throw it in. Yeah. So on December 5th, 1979, Daniel, he was arrested for a family disturbance and spent a night in jail. I don't know what the details were around that. So, But in 1979, it only got worse. On December 23rd of that year, Daniel was found unconscious in the parking lot of a bar in Craig, Colorado. And he was found early in the morning, so like 4 or 5 in the morning. And Daniel had massive head injuries, and the police said that they immediately could tell that they were extremely serious. And so he was taken to the Craig Hospital, but Craig Hospital was probably a very tiny hospital.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so they quickly realized that they couldn't handle his injuries, and they transferred him to a hospital in Denver. But he later died that day from his injuries. And this is right before Christmas. He was only 36 years old. And so the police, they were questioning patrons who were at the bar that night. And some reported that Daniel had gotten into an argument with a couple of men that night. And it was interesting because when the police found Daniel's body, they also found a knife next to him as well. But when the autopsy was performed, it was determined that Daniel died from his head injuries. And I don't think he even had any stab wounds. So the police were kind of thinking that maybe the knife was his, and
sounds like it.
Yeah, and he dropped it when he got hit. And so the police, they interrogated and polygraphed numerous suspects the following days. And through the interviews, the police started to figure out that the fight started in the parking lot, and witnesses said that they saw 2 men running from the parking lot and getting in a car. Now, this story will change because Daniel's death completely disrupted the Craig Police Department. And so after a couple weeks after Daniel's death, the police department had a complete shakeup of the staff. They fired people, they hired new people, they moved investigators, like detectives and stuff, into different sections. And the police chief said that the investigation team was improperly investigating crimes and they were writing bad reports. And one of these improperly investigated crimes was Daniel's murder investigation. Uh-oh. Yeah, so it gets a little crazy. The chief said that there were a lack of reports and detail in the case. But interestingly, by February of 1980, so just a couple months after Daniel died, the police chief, he resigned from the Craig Police Department.
Wow, and so, what's going on there?
I know, it was kind of crazy. He had charges that were brought up against him by the city attorney, and they were charges like conduct unbecoming of a police officer and detrimental to the morale of the department. So there was a lot going on, and it sounds like it was sort of started with the police chief because he resigned versus having the charges continue. So they had a complete shakeup of the police department, and basically a complete new staff came in. And so it sounds like the police were basically trying to write off Daniel's death as a, quote, drunk who just fell in a parking lot. Due to all of this, Luann, she ended up suing the police department for $1.5 million. And she claimed that, quote, city police officers failed and omitted to provide timely, prudent, and proper care for her husband. So she said not only did they fail to properly investigate his murder, but they also were really slow to transport him to a medical facility. I'm not sure he would have survived anyways, but you don't know that, and you want to get him to medical care as soon as possible. And so I never saw anything else in the papers about the lawsuit that she filed, so I'm not sure anything actually came of it. So the police, they finally did arrest and press charges against 2 men for Daniel's murder in June of 1980. And that was Floyd Gutierrez and Vidal Martinez. So the police said that the 2 men, they were arguing with Daniel in the bar. And this is where the story kind of changes. That the argument started in the bar, but then the 2 men grabbed Daniel by his arms and dragged him out of the bar. And I guess once they were outside, they accidentally dropped Daniel and he fell backwards, hitting his head on the icy pavement. So remember, this is December in Craig, hitting your head on pavement alone, but then ice is, So because of the way Daniel died, by being, quote, dropped, Floyd and Vidal, they were only charged with manslaughter. But these charges didn't stick around long, because by September of 1980, they dropped all the charges against Floyd and Vidal, and the police said that they were the wrong suspects.
Wow.
Weird, right?
They're just going all around this.
It doesn't make any sense. And so a month later, in October of 1980, they arrested 2 different men, and these men were Scott Grove and Gary Kaiser. So they were both charged with negligent homicide, and both men pled guilty to the charges. So I guess they got the right guys. And according to Margaret, the 2 men, they only served 30 days in jail. Then they were released on a work release program and had a year probation. It's crazy, right?
Oh, wow.
And it's so sad. Yeah, no doubt, right? I know. It's like, what was going on in the 80s there? Yeah. And it's sad because, 30 days in jail and Daniel left behind a wife and 2 kids. But I don't know. It's sad. So the funeral service for Daniel, it was held at the family church in Oak Creek, St. Martin's Catholic Church. And he was buried at a cemetery there. He was buried in the veterans portion of the cemetery. And the following Veterans Day, Guido and Margaret went to visit their son's grave, and they were just appalled at how neglected the graveyard was. And so they wrote into the paper about how we need to do better for our veterans and we need to keep the cemetery up. And basically they were trying to create interest in having some sort of a group come together and clean up the veterans cemetery. I couldn't find anything about what happened, but I bet they did it.
Yeah, I bet they did too.
So in 1983, Margaret, she really started experiencing health problems, and she went to Denver to have a bypass surgery. And from this point on, she would continue to struggle for the rest of her life with heart-related issues.
Oh.
I know. And in fact, 3 years later in 1986, she had a heart attack. And also in 1986, Guido, he started experiencing heart problems, but I don't think it was to the extent that Margaret did. But Margaret, she never stopped working hard to improve the area she lived in. She was part of the Yampa Women's Club, and she started a fundraiser to buy the vacant lot that was next to the library so that they could expand the library.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, and so she was able to raise the funds and expand it.
Good for her.
Yeah. And she also enjoyed writing, but specifically, she really loved writing poetry. And she actually would go on to publish a book of poems that she wrote. And she would get together with other writers in the area, and they would have poetry reading nights. Oh. Yeah, and I read one poem that she wrote about veterans. So she did write one poem about the hunters that would come every year to Oak Creek, and it was kind of a funny poem. I'm not going to read it because it's really long, but I'll sum it up. So she would talk about how all these men would invade the area wearing bright orange, and they would change the scenery of the mountain because all you would see is orange, and she said that she would end up having to cook for all of them, which she didn't mind that, but she wishes that she didn't have to hear all of their stories.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, they come back every night. We did this, and
as the evening goes on, the story gets bigger.
Right, exactly. I didn't kill 2 elk. I killed 4 elk. And so the plan for their ranch was that they would eventually give it to their son, Daniel. But after his death, Guido and Margaret weren't really sure what to do. And, they're getting older at this point. It's just too hard to run 800-acre cattle ranch. And so they decided that they would sell off most of their acres, but they wanted to keep the house and just a few acres for a summer home. And so the ranch, the acres, they eventually did sell. And Margaret and Guido, they moved to a town called Snowden. Apparently it was still fairly close to Oak Creek, but had more amenities for them. So, but they, like I said, they kept part of the ranch and they would go back and stay there in the summer. And so they bought this home just in time to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. And that's kind of neat, 50 years. So they celebrated by going to St. Martin's Church in Oak Creek. That was their church. They'd attended it for the last 50 years. And they had a renewing their vows ceremony. And after the ceremony, they had a large reception with friends and family.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And so after this, they actually went up to Denver to attend the Archbishop's special services for those who have been married for 50 or more years.
Oh.
Yeah, and so they were given a medallion, and Margaret and Guido, they said that they really enjoyed the service.
That's nice.
Yeah, pretty cool.
They did a lot.
They did a lot, yeah. So after living in Snowden for a while, Margaret, like I said earlier, she loved to write. So she decided that she was going to write a play about the town's most famous ghost, Rufus.
In Snowden?
In Snowden, yeah.
So did they have several ghosts?
I don't know. That's what I was wondering too. I'm like, the most famous ghost? Right. How many are there? So Rufus, which I have to say, I always thought that would be like the cutest name for a dog, Rufus. Mm-hmm. Isn't that the name of the dog on Cinderella, Rufus?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Rufus or Bert? What is the dog's name on Cinderella? Let me look. Okay, Bruno was the name I was thinking of. I always thought that would be a cute name for a dog, which makes sense. It's kind of Italian, so.
Right.
But anyways, so Rufus was believed to haunt the old Royal Hotel. And the owners of the hotel, they actually named the ghost Rufus, but locals who have lived in the area for a really long time, they thought that the ghost was an old cowboy named George who used to stay at the hotel during the hard winters. So when he couldn't get back to his ranch, he would just stay at the hotel. Well, sadly, one winter he passed away. And so, like I said, a lot of the locals thought that Rufus was actually George. But others think that this ghost may be one of the many people who died during the Spanish flu epidemic. Yeah, because the hotel was used as an infirmary during that time. So, yet other locals, they thought that maybe Rufus was a man who was shot and killed in the hotel a few decades back over a card game that had gone bad. So who knows? But Rufus, one thing that they could all agree on was that he was a prankster. So apparently he would shut doors. He would take the blinds of a window and bang them against the window. So, wow. And he liked to play those pranks on people who visited the hotel. But back to Margaret. She wrote a play about Rufus, and that play was performed in 1989 during the Halloween season. And the play, it was, all about Rufus and his pranks. And Margaret, she even had a part in the play. She played the part of Ghostbuster. And so she said that the story idea came to her in the middle of the night when she woke up, and she kind of quickly jotted the idea down before falling back asleep and then finished writing the play later. And she described it as a spooky comedy. So
that's cute.
I know, isn't that really cool? And I guess it played for a few years. So
wow.
Yeah, pretty neat. And so Guido and go ahead.
What year is this, or what year?
They moved to, I think they sold the ranch in the late 80s. So
89.
89. Oh yeah, that's right. 89.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So yeah, she was quite the character.
Yeah.
But Guido and Margaret, they seemed to really enjoy their new home. And, they spent a lot of time there with friends and family. I read in one article where this lady, she was talking about them. This was years after they had passed. And she said she just remembered them sitting on the porch holding hands. And
how cute.
I thought that was cute. So in August of 1992, Margaret, she fell ill with pneumonia and strep throat, but she was able to stay home, and kind of ironically, she had a nurse come to her house and tend to her. So that was kind of cool. But sadly though, this illness was really hard on Margaret, and she just never fully recovered. And that same year, on November 27th, 1992, she passed away at the age of 71.
Oh.
So she did, though, eventually, so at some point from August to November, she did have to go to Denver to stay in the hospital. And so she passed away in Denver. Obviously, Margaret's death, it really impacted Guido, but her death was extremely hard on the community as well.
Oh, I'm sure. She did a lot for every place she lived.
Every place she lived, she worked so hard to, improve it and make sure that people had the care and facilities that they needed. And so her funeral, it was held at St. Martin's Church in Oak Creek. She was buried at the same cemetery where her son was, but obviously in a different section. And Guido, he lived on his own after Margaret died, but he was always surrounded by friends and family, and he was 83 years old. Yeah, he had become ill from something. I couldn't figure out what it was, and he had to go to the hospital in Steamboat Springs, and that's where he passed away. And his funeral, it was also held at the St. Martin's Church, and he was buried next to Margaret.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And so I just kind of want to retouch on their kids. With Cheryl, I kind of quickly just talked about her and moved on, but I couldn't find a whole lot on her. So I'm not sure how her life played out, but I hope...
She moved to San Francisco.
She moved to San Francisco, yeah. But I hope she has a very happy life.
All right.
So... And so I read an article that was published in 2016 that talked about Guido and Margaret, and a woman, she lived in kind of that Yampa area. Her name was Heather Nill, and she wrote an article titled Saving Tomato Seeds. Now that's Italian. And in this article, it features Guido and Margaret. So...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, after
2016.
2016, and Guido passed away in 95, so, she remembers Margaret and Guido.
Okay,
and
I was going to say, okay, that's nice.
Yeah, and so she starts off talking about how she's really proud of her Scottish heritage, but if she couldn't be Scottish, she would definitely be Italian. And then she kind of goes on to reminisce about the Rossis and their farm life and just how great of people they were. But then she starts talking about their tomato seeds and how Guido and Margaret would always save their seeds and basically created their own heirloom tomatoes over the years by saving those seeds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so then she goes on to talk about how she learned how they saved their seeds and kind of gives people tips on how they can do that. But I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
After all those years.
Yeah.
The title of this episode is going to be Margaret and Guido Rossi Wrapped in a Blanket of Love.
Oh.
And I thought that was just really cool and kind of sums up their life a little bit. And that's actually a quote from Margaret. She was talking to a reporter, and she talked about how after her son was killed, the community just came and wrapped her and Guido in a blanket of love.
Oh.
And so I thought that was kind of a...
Yeah, that's a good saying.
It is, yeah. And especially because she continued to, over all of her years, wrap her community in a blanket of love, and then they returned that to her.
Yeah, it's very touching.
It is, yeah. So I just thought that was a nice way to end this episode.
Yeah, that was good.
It was. It was a cool...
I like that story.
I do too. It was a really neat story. And the pictures of these two are just, they're so cute. And I'll put them on, all of the social media. But we probably should... call that good before I completely lose my voice.
I know. I've been hearing you for about the last half hour. Just getting.
Yeah, it gets a little hoarser. But yeah, we're glad to be back. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on whatever podcast platform you listen to or follow or whatever it is now. I think some of them are subscribe. Yeah. Some of them are follow. And if you feel inclined, give us a rating. We'd like to see some of those ratings. But yeah, so I think we'll call that good for today. So we hope you enjoyed listening to the story of Guido and Margaret Rossi, and we hope you come back to listen to more stories about Italian Americans. See you next time.
See you next time.